Hi. We were not planning to do this reaction yet, and I don't know if it'll be the next one that we edit and upload or not. But we were rewatching this show for fun and came up on the episode naturally, and we don't want to watch out of order, and we're going to be reacting to it soon anyway, so we're just going to react to it. This is a blurry mix currently of people who would have been around for this episode anyway, so it's working out pretty well, and we've already done makeup for something else, so it seemed like a pretty good time. We should have enough time to do it. So this is an episode of DID in the Media, where we react to representations of dissociative identity disorder, which is what we have in media of some kind. So far it's been TV shows, and specifically crime drama related TV shows, which is a common portrayal of DID. And we do 2 versions of each of these videos. We do the normal reaction that we put up on our main channel, and we do an extended cut, which is like a watch-along commentary that we put on Patreon. So if you're interested in the Patreon extended cut where you can watch along and get all of our reactions to even the smaller details and things that aren't related to DID or mental health generally, that is where you can find that and see all of our reactions to everything and literally watch it along with us. We give you timestamps and everything. Otherwise, if you just want our main thoughts and reactions about it, the version on the channel is the one for you. So this time we are reacting to an episode of the TV show Lie to Me. It's season 2, episode 1. It's called The Core of It. And if you're not familiar with the show, it is a psychological crime drama, basically. It's generally less graphic and a little less intense than Criminal Minds, but less comedy kind of than Psych. It's somewhere in between in terms of comparing to ones we've reacted to before. And the idea is generally about analyzing facial expressions and body language and things to find out what people are feeling and whether or not they're lying. And we have watched through the whole show and recently started rewatching it, like I said. And that is the episode that we're reacting to now. So, one big trigger warning that I know I want to give, especially for any of you watching along with us, is there is some semi-graphic sexual content in the sense of emotionally graphic and triggering for SA. And it's important to the plot, and it's something we're definitely going to be discussing, but there is a pretty intense point in the episode that's about that. So we will make an effort to warn you when that's coming and before we talk about it in any kind of detail, but that is part of the content of this episode. I think that's the only major trigger warning. If there are others that we don't remember, we will put them on the screen or edit in another part of me saying it later when we realize what it is. Oh yeah. There's some graphic violence stuff in this, and blood and stuff, because it's a murder mystery. But without further ado, let's start the reaction. So, starting off strong, the idea of memories in a system leaking through in weird ways and seeming like visions or dreams even, or things like that, is something that can happen. Memories can bleed through in funny ways sometimes. And it's definitely an interesting way to do this plot, so I don't think it's misleading. Obviously, it wouldn't happen with everyone, and it's the way that you interpret bits of memories that don't make sense, assuming you're in some level of denial, is going to depend a lot on like other beliefs and things that you have. So if you're open to the idea of psychic visions, that's probably what you're going to think they are. But if you're not, maybe you'll think that you hallucinated, or you're just under too much stress and your imagination's getting away from you, or who knows. But it is definitely very possible to misinterpret bits of memories like that when they don't fit the rest of the context of your life. You're trying to find some excuse for what those flashes of memories were, generally. And flashes of memories bleeding through like that can be pretty common, even in systems with higher amnesia. There can be points where it bleeds through a little bit. In our system, it happens the most when there's really intense emotions involved, and or details that are starting to click with an alter in our system who doesn't have that memory of, if something starts making sense of why would these things be the way they are if it weren't for this, and you start like expecting that type of memory to be there, then if something like that gets triggered for somebody who holds the memory in our system, pieces of that can bleed through. So it depends on the situation, it depends on the alter and the system, but that kind of gray area when it comes to amnesia can be pretty common. So the amnesia obviously is a good thing to point out. There seems to be fairly black and white amnesia between Trisha and Jesse. As far as we know, Trisha doesn't know anything about Jesse. We don't. And we know for a fact that Jesse doesn't know, or at least I guess is claiming not to know, Lightman, despite Trisha being in his office earlier the same day. So it's a pretty good example of what that amnesia can look like day to day. And in fact, one of the questions on, I forget what it's called, but it's a dissociation like questionnaire type thing to figure out what level of dissociation you have generally. One of those questions is if people will come up to you acting like they know you and you don't know who they are, especially if they call you a different name, because that's a sign of DID. And if they don't call you a different name but you still don't remember them, it could be a sign of heavy dissociation generally, like dissociative amnesia, without necessarily having the system component. But that would be a pretty classic example of how day-to-day amnesia can look like that. And in our experience, that type of thing is going to happen the most when we see someone again in a very different kind of context. So this would be a really easy example. Jesse is in a hotel room that Trisha doesn't even really know about. Part of like that life that is Jesse's and not Trisha's. And Lightman suddenly showing up there, it's still enough of like Jesse's world, essentially, that it'd be unlikely for Trisha to switch. So in our case, if we met someone again like that, in the same type of situation we met them in the first place, we would probably just switch to whoever knows them. because recognizing them would be enough to pull that alter to the front. But if it's in a situation that's too much like belonging to someone else, like this, or triggering for someone else, that's the most likely situation in our system where someone would keep fronting who doesn't know who that is, because it draws attention to our dissociation and our amnesia if we don't know who it is, and if it's clear that we don't know who it is. So when it's feasible, it's easier to cover that up by just switching to whoever does know. But if that would break important amnesia walls, like Trisha fronting in the middle of the hotel room she had the scary vision about, dressed like that and everything, dressed like Jessie, it would tell Trisha too much about Jessie and Jessie's life and job and things like that. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at for this. I do like already that Lightman, for the most part, is like acting differently and talking differently to Jessie than he did with Trisha, because he sees how different they are, and that's like validating essentially for them being individuals. So this is a really, really good analysis because this show is so much about nonverbal cues. I think it's one of the better representations of like paying attention to the fairly subtle and not so subtle differences between switches. Like between alters after switches, essentially. Also during switching, I guess. Which I think that was a pretty good representation of a switch. It's what we would consider a medium-ish length switch. Not an immediate one, but it didn't take very long. It was 3-4 seconds, something like that. But it was like a slightly dissociated, stopped for a second, blinking a little bit. Looked like a little bit of like head and neck pain, which is very common for us with switching. And then the switch, and then settling in from the switch. But paying specific attention to the differences in posture and like how you carry yourself and things like that. Difference in facial expressions, and then letting down her hair, which is getting more comfortable just generally. And I think it's a really good analysis of that. And some switches would be more obvious and some would be more subtle, but I think it's a pretty good middle ground representation of it being noticeable if you know what you're looking for, but probably wouldn't be that noticeable if you didn't. Like maybe you would think it was a mood swing or something otherwise, or she just got frustrated or bored and decided to leave, or got a headache and decided to leave. Like, there's so many things that you can explain that away as if you don't know what you're looking for. But if you do, especially if you get to know someone, or in this case, if you're very practiced at looking at nonverbal cues, you can see the difference in different alters, even without them talking, without them doing any of the more obvious things if they weren't masking. And not always, like there are going to be times where the masking is good enough, or you don't know them quite well enough, or two alters in particular are similar enough that you don't notice. And like that's also completely valid, but it is very possible in a lot of cases to see like visual differences in how you're just like sitting and existing after a switch. So I think that's completely reasonable for that to be part of this plot, and for them to have it on camera and be able to be like, look, that's a totally different person now in the same body. And I do like that it's somewhat normalized in this kind of a setting, because she is specifically a therapist, psychiatrist, somewhere in there, psychologist maybe. So she should have a basic understanding of DID and related disorders, and the general just like immediate acceptance of this is what it looks like, so this is probably what it is, and not trying to explain it away as something else is refreshing. So that's my thoughts on that part, I guess. They already know Jesse isn't the only alter because Trisha is an alter. Everybody in the system is an alter. The host or whoever seems the most real to you or core or whatever is still an alter. They are all alters. You have already met 2 of them. You already know there are at least 2. So getting that out of the way. I'm glad that they had the moment of Lightman saying it was multiple personality disorder, and then I'm completely blanking on her name right now, but the psychologist, his partner in the business, correcting him and saying it's called DID now. And saying specifically that there is empirical evidence of that kind of memory transfer, and it could easily have been perceived as a vision. I think that explanation makes perfect sense, and memory transfer in systems is absolutely a thing that can happen. Our system has that happen, and it can be intentional or unintentional. The idea that they also pretty much immediately say that there are probably, or at least could be, other alters is also refreshing, because there are a lot of cases where it seems like they default to assuming it's only however many they've already met, and that's very often gonna not be the case. So I think even the most common system size that's recorded generally is more than 2 or 3, not by a lot, but it's in more of the 5 to 8 type range, I think. I'm pulling that out of thin air. I don't remember if that's what it is. It feels like I remember that being the case, that the most common wasn't the minimum, because the minimum is 2. But I also like that they're immediately looking at both the possibilities that one of the alters committed the murder or that one of them just witnessed it, because both of those should be on the table right now. They don't know enough right now to know which of those things it could be, and they're not just immediately assuming that there's an evil alter they haven't met yet who likes running around murdering people. So it's refreshing that they're not saying that that must be the case, because that they should be considering that as a possibility. Not that there's an evil alter that likes murdering people, but that an alter in the system committed the murder, and Trisha only got pieces of the memory, but it's also at least as plausible that someone just witnessed it. So it's important for them to be looking at both of those things. I feel like there was something else I wanted to say. Oh, the different handwriting. That's a common thing in systems for alters to have different handwriting. It's not true across the board. Not every system will have alters with different handwriting, or some might be more similar than others even within the same system. It just depends. And I think it depends somewhat on how amnesia works for that specific system, but also which types of experiences that system has. Our system has more consistent handwriting, I would say. And I think it's because we have very low amnesia for procedural memory, how to do different things. So we don't have like one alter who learned proper handwriting and a different alter who didn't, so they don't know how to do it. It's not like that. So we generally have more similar handwriting, but that's gonna depend on the system. But it would be, like, it makes perfect sense for that to be something that they show here, especially the types of things that they look at in this show. It would make sense for them to include that as a detail. That might have been everything I wanted to say. If there was something else, hopefully I'll remember it later. I don't like... it's complicated. I don't love hypnosis being brought up in context with DID. I think it is much more complicated at best to try to do hypnosis within systems. I think it could get dangerous in the sense of potentially getting around amnesia barriers that need to be in place, or at least need to come down very slowly if they're going to, and with a lot of prep work first. And sometimes the way that it's portrayed, and even things that I've heard happening to people in real life, it can be used like as a way to try to rush that, basically, to try to skip several steps ahead and just figure out whatever specific thing you're looking for. And I think in that kind of a context, it's unsafe and selfish on the part of the professionals in some cases if they're trying to figure out information for their own sake. Like in this case, if they're trying to get information out of Jessie or out of the system generally using hypnosis, they're not putting... like, they're not doing any of the work you're supposed to do before getting into any kind of trauma work. And anything that's getting around amnesia walls, anything remotely emotional or intense, is going to be at least borderline trauma work. The other thing I want to say is I think it makes perfect sense for Jessie to be interpreting this situation somewhat sexually. It is very, very common for different alters with different life experiences to view the same situation very differently. So Trisha was more willing to be there in a lot of ways. She had more informed consent at the very least. But she also seems to have different, like, very different life experiences than Jessie. And so Jessie is seeing it different. She's seeing it more sexual and probably less safe, but maybe just, like, I think her perspective feels more realistic to her. Like, it is probably going somewhere that she won't love, but it's more so the type of perspective of, like, most things are probably going there. And generally speaking, life experiences shape how you see things. So I think it makes perfect sense for her interpretation to look like that. Let's see how this hypnosis thing plays out, because I don't remember exactly how this goes. I think the other thing that I find unrealistic about a lot of the depictions of using hypnosis with systems is, especially in a case like this, Foster's her name, that's right. Jessie met Foster like 6 seconds ago. So how on earth, with the kind of underlying trauma that this system has, could Jessie get that relaxed in a situation she has already determined feels sexually unsafe? How could she get relaxed enough to actually be hypnotized? Like, it's It feels unlikely to me. I have a strong, like, emotional pushback reaction against hypnosis anyway, so that might be part of why I feel like that, because I would be getting less and less relaxed the more I was being told to relax. But if my therapist, who we have been seeing for like 4 or 5 years or something at this point, tried to bring up doing hypnosis and I, for some reason, didn't turn him down, I don't think he could get us that relaxed. Not even close. So, it feels unlikely to me. And they also talked specifically about using hypnosis to get around the amnesia by delving into, like, the unconscious, which is exactly the thing I'm worried about, that it's trying to evade, like, the amnesia walls, which are there for a reason. And you're not supposed to just, like, slip under them and see what you can find. The other thing that I'm worried about, I don't remember if this happens, is that they're going to try to use hypnosis specifically to force switches, which I also don't like, because I don't generally like forced switches without prior consent or significant safety risk or something like that. Certainly not just to get information you want out of them, you know? Okay, asking for a switch is a little better than forcing one. So one thing I want to point out is the type of system knowledge that they're showing now that they're under hypnosis can be a thing that a system has even if they have day-to-day amnesia. You can have general awareness of other alters in the system, even interact with them in your inner world if you have one, without knowing what they do day to day when they're fronting. Like, you could still have blackout amnesia about when they're fronting, but know things about them and who they are. It depends on your levels of communication, which can, and very often do, improve in time once you know about the system. I have no idea how realistic the idea is that you would suddenly unlock that kind of information by doing hypnosis. I have no idea if that's a thing. If that would get around dissociative amnesia or not. Especially if the idea is that they don't have any awareness of each other at all otherwise, and then under hypnosis they not only know about each other but have previously formed opinions about each other. That feels unlikely to me. But generally speaking, if you have some level of communication and awareness, it is also realistic, I would say, that you would know who the trauma holder is or who the trauma holders are, even if you have amnesia about the trauma. I think that's pretty common. It's pretty common in our system. Most of our system knows, like, who major trauma holders are, even if they know nothing or next to nothing about what the trauma is. It's also very possible to know some of the general information without knowing any specifics, or sometimes knowing just a couple specifics. Like, maybe you know the type of trauma it is, generally what, like, stage of life you were when it happened, and, like, who did it or something. But you could know none of that and still know who holds the trauma, or you could know just one of those things or a couple of those things. Or you could know a lot about it, still without having the memory. We have different levels of all of that in our system. Some of our major protectors and executives in particular share some information as it makes sense for safety reasons, so that other executives know how to make decisions related to safety about that type of thing, so that they can know if the trauma holder or protector who would normally be handling that isn't around for some reason. Other executives would know generally what needs to be done. if one of those safety risks came up unexpectedly. But like, Trisha knowing which alter it is who was traumatized would make sense to me. If there's like communication and awareness at all. I don't like the idea that Foster is immediately asking about trauma. Especially because she's asking Trisha, who she perceives as the host, and I think is probably the host, which is very likely to be the wrong first person, at least, to ask about trauma in a system. Hosts can be trauma holders, but I find in my experience that they're less likely to be, for the most part. But anyone in the system can be a trauma holder, and anyone in the system can be a host. So you could have a host who's a persecutor. But generally speaking, it is not good practice professionally with mental health, and not good practice with strangers generally, to ask about trauma, because there is a lot of prep work you're supposed to do before that if you're going to do any kind of trauma processing professionally. And you should have a fairly close relationship with someone, I think, before you ask about their trauma unprompted. It is very different if someone comes to you and asks if they can share their trauma with you, even if you're not very close, or if they bring up something just like if they reference something in passing and you offer to listen if they want to talk about it. That's very different than asking, do you know if anything bad happened to you as a kid? Tell me the worst thing that's ever happened to you, person I met literally a minute ago. That's not how that's supposed to work, and professionally, you're supposed to build a fairly strong, trusting relationship with the client first and get a lot of coping skills down first before you do any kind of trauma work. It's very important, because otherwise you're just triggering them and they still don't know how to deal with it, and they don't trust you enough to actually process it in any kind of a productive way. You're just triggering them. So that detail is very, very frustrating for me, because I think Foster should know better. And I don't think the situation currently calls for that. They don't really have any reason to think that this system's trauma is at all related to the crime. So even if you're going to argue that she's ignoring the normal practice of how this would be done because she's pressed for time, because there's a murder that hasn't been solved, there's no reason to think that their trauma from years and years ago is related in any way. So it's hard not to feel like it's just like a tool for them to have against the system if they need to trigger them really badly for some reason. Anyway, that's my thoughts on that. So, generally speaking, the fact that when she started panicking like that, they were telling her she was safe, I think that's a fairly reliable thing to do. The other go-to thing that we do the most is telling people where they are and what's happening. Because panic like that immediately after a switch can, in our case, is very likely to be one of two things. One is a flashback, in which case telling them where they are and what's happening is grounding from the flashback. The other is significant enough amnesia that they don't recognize some or all of what's around them. So someone who's been dormant for a while, who's just been deep inside for a long time, since before we moved here, someone who doesn't recognize our partner system, things like that, and telling them where they are and what's going on will also be comforting to them, because if they don't know where they are but then find out that this is where we live, that is helpful information as a starting point to build off of, and helpful to know that they're not like it's a different level of control over the situation than if they think they're at someone else's house, for instance. So that can be a generally good grounding thing to do, and like encouraging. I think it is very realistic that an alter who doesn't know what's going on, waking up in that setting with all kinds of monitors and things on her, would be very distressed and would have good reason to be, having no idea what's going on, being in a small clinical looking room covered in wires and stuff. It would panic me, so that makes perfect sense. Let's see who Sophie is. So there's a couple things about this that, despite me being upset about it, are accurate. One is that it's fairly common for long-term hosts, when they find out about a system, to feel this way. Sophie is saying that the other alters stole her life and she's the real one, and things like that. She also said that that's what her doctors say, and it is unfortunately something that some professionals will still say, despite it being like clinically outdated information. It's not really still supported by more current research. We are planning, or by the time this goes up, have maybe already made a video about this, specifically about like the idea of the core and different perspectives on it, and how much different perspectives on it are supported by research and stuff like that currently. I think there are ways to think of one or more cores in a system that are supported by research, or are like just individual perspective, basically, if it's a way that you structure the way you think about the system. Things like that. I think there are also things that are very real and valid that can make it seem like one or more alters are more real than other ones. One really easy example is the form of OSDD, where other alters are less like distinct. If they seem like different versions of the host is a common version of that I've heard of. Or like more roles, but a little bit more two-dimensional in their roles in that kind of a way, or like fragments compared to like full alters. But it's about like how distinct they are and how like fully developed kind of they are. So it can seem like some are more real than others. This doesn't seem like a case like that to me. It seems like Sophie is still having trouble accepting the idea of the system, and feels like the other alter stole her life, and feels like it is her life that they came in and changed and did things to. That's not... It makes a lot of sense to feel that way, but that's not how systems work. And it can be very, very harmful to the system's ability to function at all, and the system's perspective on you and things, if, as a host or anyone else in the system, if you push back against their involvement at all and have this kind of an attitude of, this is my life and you're in my way and I wish you weren't here, and things like that, because it's not like that. And everyone in our system shares this life. And we do sometimes get in each other's way, but that's not all that we do. We also help each other, and we each have like different pieces of the life that's ours for the most part, and we share some other pieces of it. But it is much more effective and helpful to work together, even if you're working toward fusion. in the meantime to work together, because the type of attitude of working together and things like that would also help if you're working toward fusion. The hostility and anger and pushback against any involvement from the other alters is going to get in the way of cooperation and fusion. So it gets in the way of really all of the existing treatment paths for DID. You want to either be working together more effectively for functional multiplicity, or that's the word, right? Functional multiplicity? I think it is. Or if you're working toward final fusion, you need to like be learning about each other, get more comfortable with each other, more comfortable with what each other do, to be breaking down amnesia walls. So I feel like this is realistic but unhelpful and frustrating. Because it's also very, very easy and natural for other alters in the system to perceive this kind of attitude as rejection. And that can be really, really hard, especially for alters who have willingly or unwillingly protected the host, in this case, Sophie, from horrible things. If I've been through horrible things and you haven't because I went through them instead, and you're saying that I'm just getting in your way, like that, in our experience, that's a good way to make a persecutor. So it can be really hard to get there at first, because it can feel like it was completely your life, and then suddenly all of these other people were there getting in your way. But most hosts learn about their system years and years after it has been existing. So it wasn't ever just one person's life. It was shared the whole time. The thing Lightman just did of taking a step to build trust by unlocking the door because Sophie was clearly so panicked about being trapped there. Like, they're doing a lot of good stuff at this point of filling her in on what's going on, giving her like the foundation information that she needs, asking her fairly simple, straightforward questions that are clearly related to the issue that they're talking about, explaining exactly why they think she's in danger and why it's so important. And that, like, Trisha specifically came to them, they didn't seek her out, all of those things, but then unlocking the door and making very, very clear, I am not, like, restraining you. I'm not trapping you here. You can leave, but I'm trying to help you, and this is why I think it's important. It's a really, really good way to start building that trust, especially when someone's first time meeting you was that terrified and panicked and having no idea what's going on. Like, they started several steps back from where they want to be, and they're trying to take those baby steps forward, and I think they're currently doing a pretty decent job of that. This is a fairly small, nitpicky thing that I really like, but the brother, when he realized it was Sophie and not Jessie, treated it like a full reunion, like he hadn't seen her in a while, because he hadn't, even though he has seen Jessie more recently. And I think that's a really good sign of people who truly understand and validate the system and the different alters being different people. They will act like it is a different person to that extent. Like, if you switch in the middle of a conversation, they'll start the conversation over if you need it, but, like, he's acting like he hasn't seen her in a while, because he hasn't, and I really like that little detail. So, a couple things. The perspective protectors have is going to be different from system to system, and in a lot of cases from alter to alter, and can even change over time. But not all protectors feel explicitly like they are protecting the host or any other specific alter from the thing that is happening to them. Not all protectors switch on purpose to protect the system, but the ones who do could just as easily feel like they are protecting the system as a whole, or even just feel like they are the best person to handle the situation in the system. They know what to do and the other people don't. So they're essentially protecting themselves from whatever the consequences would be of someone else fronting instead for the dangerous situation. However, it is also very common for protectors to be essentially a type of trauma holder who gets triggered out for certain types of situations, or all scary situations maybe in a smaller system with only one protector. And that is less or not at all by choice. And in that case, they are largely protecting themselves. Or they might not even feel like they're protecting anybody. They might even push back against the title of protector for a long time. And some in that situation might never consider themselves a protector and might only think of themselves as a trauma holder. They're just the person the bad things happen to, but that doesn't mean they protected anybody. So the specific wording of RJ could, she didn't say switch, she was using every word she could think of except switch, which is also frustrating. She said like transition and emerge and all those types of things. But the idea that he would switch specifically because Sophie was scared to protect Sophie is something that could happen, but is not the way that every protector necessarily would see that. For instance, a lot of our protectors would switch because they got scared from inside because of whatever thing triggered them externally. It's not always the case. Jade is a really good example. I'm going to talk in third person even though she's part of the mix of who's here. But Jade will be triggered to front if one of her kids or a lot of other littles potentially, not all of her kids are little, but you know what I mean. If a little and or one of her kids gets scared while in the front, that's something that can trigger Jade, and it's to protect them. But generally speaking, when Jade gets triggered to the front, something scared her or made her angry, or whatever emotional response tied to the trigger, or no emotional response in some cases, just the trigger to the front. And it's not about Aura or Anna, who was our first host, or any other specific alter protecting them from what's happening. It's she is now in the front and should do whatever she can to like minimize how bad the situation is going to get, but largely for her own sake, because she's the one who's now fronting, so whatever happens is happening to her, you know? I think it's important to keep that in mind, that not every system structures the way their roles work and the way they think about things around the host or a core or anything like that. Not everything everybody in the system does is about one specific alter, even if that alter fronts the most or is the face of the system or has the body's legal name or whatever. And again, it is very possible for some alters to feel that way. Some protectors could explicitly feel like they are stepping in to protect the host specifically, but not everyone is going to feel that way. This is also the point that I'm going to warn you, especially if you're watching along, but even if you're just listening, what I'm going to be talking about soon, and the scene that's about to happen, is the really intense SA-related scene. And it's not sexually graphic, like directly, but it's there's a lot of what I would consider emotionally and verbally graphic threats, essentially. Nothing happens, but it's deliberately trying to be very triggering for that, and it does it well. So that's about to happen, so let's get through that part. That is an important thing to talk about, is that can be a very real fear in a system, particularly for a host who suddenly finds out about the system. The fear that one day you just won't front anymore. And that type of thing can happen, at least temporarily, if you go dormant or just like don't front for a really long time. Somebody holds the front for a while, or whatever happens where you're not fronting for a while. That type of thing can happen, and it can be scary. And I think it's important to validate those types of fears and how, like the amnesia component in particular, and the unknown aspects of what if the way this all works changes again type thing, can be really scary. That being said, a lot of the times that major system changes and things like that happen are for pretty significant reasons, like a host going dormant. That type of thing is often going to be due to very significant stress, or some specific protector needing to front for a long time, or something like that. So in a lot of cases, like the way we try to think about it is, if something more extreme like that happens in our system, in a lot of cases it's because our system needed it for some reason. That altar needed a break for a while, so they went dormant, or that altar was being consistently triggered for a while, so they were front stuck for a while. And it doesn't necessarily make a lot of those things easier, but feeling like there's a purpose to it can help. And in our case, any of the situations that are not like that, where it's not helpful, like if, say, a persecutor is trying to hold the front for bad reasons or something like that, there are usually things we can do about that internally, with gatekeepers' help and things like that. So it's still, I think it's a fair and accurate portrayal of the types of fear that can come along with finding out you're part of a system. So I did want to throw that out there. That scene is still coming up. Hasn't quite happened yet, though. The bad part of the scene is over, but I am going to talk about it now. Generally speaking, triggering altars is not okay. Particularly negative triggers, particularly without ever having discussed it before with the system to see if it's okay, which things would be too far. Particularly with someone you barely know at all, for what I would argue is not a good enough reason. And without having at any point yet just asked for that altar to front. They did that at other points. They asked for Trisha to front, but they have not yet asked for RJ to front. They are just assuming he can't or won't if it's not, like, life-threatening. So he's convincing the system that it is life-threatening using what he knows to be the trauma that formed their system. And knowing that he is going to be perceived as, like, scary and male and older and in a position of authority and power, and knowing how to do that and realizing when, like, the words by themselves weren't scaring her enough, actually, like, physically hurting her, all to force RJ to front. There are a couple big reasons that this is horrifying. Like I said, they didn't ask RJ to front, or ask RJ without fronting, because sometimes other altars can hear from inside without switching. They haven't asked RJ to, like, share the necessary information with whoever is fronting. In this case, it was Sophie. It is also an acceptable outcome for the police to interview her and find out that she is not the one who knows about it, and so she can't currently help them. And if she ends up switching with RJ or gets more pieces of the memory, she'll let them know. It is not her responsibility. It's not this system's responsibility to solve the murder, even if they're a witness. Just like anybody else, if they witnessed something and went into shock or had any other version of amnesia, dissociative or otherwise, in response to witnessing a murder, doesn't give you the right to torture them to get information you want. It's not their responsibility. And if you end up finding out eventually that there's evidence that they are the murderer, then maybe that changes things a little bit, but still not enough to do this. Because you would need other evidence anyway. And if you, like, have them in custody for a while because there's enough evidence for that, but they can't confess because they don't remember it, treat it like any other situation where there's amnesia after the fact for whatever reason. It is also... It's a horrible thing to do to anyone under any circumstances, or to convince someone you are going to do to them. Especially after building some of that trust and then doing something like this. Using the information that you gained by building that trust to specifically weaponize an attack to this extent, the area that you know is the most vulnerable. For your own reasons, for your own gain, basically. Obviously without consent. It's horrifying. And that level of trigger, that level of utterly convincing them that the worst things that have ever happened to them are happening again now, right now, can do extreme, lasting damage to somebody. And I mean, like, including permanent damage, including killing people. Like, this type of thing can kill somebody. And it can destroy any progress they've made of trying to learn to trust people again. It can set them back years and years in therapy. It is a big deal. And there is absolutely no excuse in this or any other context I can think of for going anywhere near this far. Anywhere near this far. Particularly when you know so little about the system and the protector you're trying to trigger. You don't know the type of trauma response you're going to be dealing with. And in this case, they triggered RJ to fight, which, in my experience, makes me think RJ thought he was at immediate risk of significant bodily harm and or death. Because that is a pretty, not always, but it can be a pretty extreme trauma response to be your go-to immediate response. Particularly in a female presenting body, I find that to be a less common first trauma response. Maybe that's just because it's less common for us, but it feels less common to me. But they could just have easily unknowingly triggered somebody else other than RJ, for one thing. They don't know for sure that they know of everyone in the system yet. in particular because it's always possible that even the alters you have talked to don't know about everyone in the system. But also, when we get triggered badly enough, we don't have access to our current memories while we are that level of triggered. If you trigger me into a full flashback because you need information about something I did yesterday, I cannot tell you that information until I'm out of that flashback. Assuming I'm like functional at all once I get out of the flashback. So it can be counterproductive even for like the totally self-serving perspective of what he's trying to do. You could also trigger that alter to be nonverbal, or at the very least to be utterly unwilling to help you or talk to you at all. You could end up dealing with a persecutor who turns things inward and starts hurting themselves instead of fighting against you. But you can also be causing long-term, like, over and over and over ripple effects from this type of thing. You might not see you probably won't see all of the harm that you cause from doing something like this. Because you could be triggering more than one alter, you could be triggering more than the one that you see who switches, and maybe one of the other ones that you triggered does something you don't see tomorrow. Or even the one that you knew that you triggered has a flashback about being triggered in this way tomorrow, and something else happens. But at the very least, it's reinforcing the idea that you're never safe, and of course this type of thing is going to happen over and over and over when you least expect it, and all of those things, which with CPTSD in particular, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it is more likely for your like entire worldview to be shaped like that by the trauma that happened. So because like such a significant chunk of your life already has been shaped completely by that, or at least significantly by that. So that's just reinforcing that effect of CPTSD of course, any random person in my life in any way could be the next person to do something like that to me. You know? It's horrible. I don't even really care if he thinks he's protecting Sophie, or the system as a whole, or whoever. He didn't even try to ask. He could have just said, "Can I talk to RJ?" Or, "Can you tell RJ something for me?" And then if he found out that they have no communication, he could have asked, "Can I trigger you really badly to see if I can get RJ to switch?" In our experience, it would still work if you're gonna go that far. But there are so many things that could have gone wrong with that and interfered with what he is explicitly trying to do, even ignoring all of the harm that he's doing by doing that. He could have done all of that harm and gotten nothing out of it, or gotten, like, negative results out of it. Another easy example is if he found out the hard way that RJ is also a persecutor, and one of the things RJ decides to do as a persecutor in this moment is to confess to a murder that the system didn't do. Because he has internalized needing to be punished for something or whatever. He has no idea how RJ would respond to any of these types of situations. And he's getting the most heightened, angry, alert, scared version of RJ that exists. So everything is going to be turned up to 11. I need to keep going because I could talk about this for too long, and I don't have all day, and I don't want this to be ridiculously long. So I'm going to keep going. Foster, who is supposed to be the expert on psychology and stuff like that out of the group, just said that alters are one-dimensional, which is not true. Some alters can be less distinct and a little bit more one-dimensional, such as fragments, or like I said earlier in, I think it's OSDD 1A, the one where alters are less distinct. But generally speaking, alters can be like very fleshed out three-dimensional people. That being said, having mute nonverbal alters is very common. There can be complicated reasons for that. I could see it being true that it's because RJ is a protector who has never needed to speak, but I think it'd probably run deeper than that. It'd probably be related to, like, this is a purely physical threat, so words can't help me and are pointless and could only make things worse. Or there can be specific trauma-related things, like if you were constantly, like, told to shut up, basically. If you were expected to be quiet all the time, that can end up leading to that type of thing. It can also be common for trauma holders to end up being mute nonverbal, specifically as, like, an internalized way of not telling anybody any of the things that happen to them. There can be a lot of complicated reasons. This seems oversimplified, but it could also be oversimplified just because they're in a hurry. So I am glad that Foster is furious with him for what he did. It doesn't make me feel any better about what he did, but if she agreed with him, that would be worse. So let's keep going. I don't like this idea of sending Sophie in pretending to be Jessie to do arguably Jessie's job, maybe someone else's job, but definitely not Sophie's. You could make an argument that it's anybody's job in the system that we've met except Sophie. Maybe not RJ because there's too much talking involved, but they're making the argument that it's a way for her to get her power back, essentially. But alters have their specific roles and their specific identities and personalities and everything for a reason. And in a lot of cases, other alters, or at least some other alters in the system, would not be capable of doing the things, at least not at the drop of a hat like this, that other alters in the system do. We are built differently, we form differently, and we have different life experiences that shape who we are and what we're capable of. But it's also, if you're not a good actor, it's hard to pretend to be someone you're not. Especially someone you're not used to pretending to be like. It could be easier for some other alters in the system to pretend to be Sophie, potentially, if they grew up masking as her. But this seems like a really rushed, forced way to make Sophie feel like she's more real and doesn't need any of the rest of them, which I think is a bad message to try to send her and could get her hurt. It would not always be successful, particularly with no previous practice, to fight switches like that when someone is being triggered. In this case in particular, arguably Jessie and RJ are being triggered, because it seems like a safety risk, which would pull RJ, and this is a situation typically that would be Jessie's life. This is Jessie's life, and they're dressed like Jessie and everything. So everything else about the environment and the behavior of the person they're talking to, everything would be triggering Jessie, and the danger is triggering RJ. It is really hard to fight particularly triggered switches without any practice. Not everybody can do it. Some people can do it a lot better than others. The people who can do it better than others, in most cases, have a lot of practice and or are like specific roles where it's part of like why they exist to do that. Like gatekeepers would be a good example. Or like certain altars who form specifically to hold the front against certain types of triggers or things like that. There can be cases where that's part of somebody's job, and that's why they exist, and it's built into what they're capable of when they originally split. But Sophie, with no previous practice, fighting off two different switches at the same time with that type of heightened situation when she's terrified, there's no universe where this works out well. Except apparently the one that's actually in the show. So, just throwing that out there. That's not a good thing to expect of somebody. I guess unless they tell you that they can do it. Like if I told you that was part of my job, it was something I knew I could do. That's different, but we didn't see the conversation about planning this, but I don't feel like it was likely to have gone that way. I think they probably, if anything, even pressured Sophie a little bit, telling her that it would make her feel like she had control over her life again and stuff. Anyway, so, final thoughts I have to do kind of quickly. I'm running out of time. This reaction took a little bit longer than I anticipated. So, it is refreshing that it is a crime drama where the DID system is a witness and not the murderer. I appreciate that a lot. It's rare for this genre of DID representation and for DID representation in like Hollywood style popular media in the first place. I like that a lot. They called it the right thing. They called it DID. And they specifically updated the name from multiple personality disorder, which I appreciate because that helps to tell people that it's the same disorder, but it's not called multiple personality disorder anymore. I think the switches are very realistic. I think the altars do a good job of showing how different you can be and act and look and everything in the same body. I think the altars are very well fleshed out as individuals. Unlike the description of them being one-dimensional, I think they are shown to be properly three-dimensional and just described poorly. The literal assault and threats of SA to force a triggered switch is horrible and should never be done under any circumstances I can think of. The consequences are so high and unpredictable for something like that. It's not okay. I think the consequences are dramatically downplayed in this. Too many members of the system are still okay with working with and around him. And Sophie in particular, who was fronting for the start of that whole thing, I have to think has amnesia about it now, otherwise wouldn't have felt relief and couldn't have hugged him when he came in after she was in another dangerous situation that he put her in. So I think unless that memory got taken from her after the fact, like once RJ switched or later on in the day even, because that can happen too, there can be delayed amnesia where the parts of the memory that aren't related to things you should know about get taken away afterward. Unless that's what happened, it doesn't make any sense to me that she would be at all okay being around him that soon after, probably ever. I don't think she'd even be able to fake it that well, that early, because that's not part of her job as far as we can tell in the context of that story. The descriptions of Sophie being like the real one and stuff like that are a little bit frustrating, but fairly realistic in that it's mostly described from her perspective of feeling like her life was taken over by other people and things like that. It's based in her fear and denial and being overwhelmed and things like that, and that makes sense. It's not the way modern research really describes DID. There's not a real one, and then the alter is everybody's an alter. And all of the roles are important. The host isn't more real, they just have a different job, you know? So a lot of times the host will be the closest to what everyone or most of the people who know the system see the system as, if they don't know about the system, because it's very common for the host to be who everyone else masks as, and the host to be who most people know personally in everyday life type things, because the host fronts the most. So it can feel a little bit like that from the outside, in the sense that that's the person you know, or that's the person you know the most. Everyone else seems like new and very different, but that still doesn't mean that the host is real and the others are less real in any way. Everyone in the system is real. So I think that's important to point out. I said the switches are realistic. The like posture stuff and things like that I think are really good. All the different alters are very different from each other, which can be how that works, but it's also very possible for some alters to be more similar to each other. It's going to depend on the system. I think it's more common in smaller systems for everybody to be more different. In my like just subjective experience, that feels true, because there are more like extreme differences that are still available, essentially, if it's a smaller group of people. But like in our case, when there's over 200 of us, we can't all be that extremely different from each other, because there are only so many ways to be. So we'd have to be very one-dimensional to be that different from each other. So like a lot of us like the same type of music, for instance, but not all of us. But there's definitely overlap in different alters, so that's something to point out, I guess. But I think it's a fairly good representation of the disorder, a not really at all good representation of how to treat someone with the disorder, but moments of it were good. The brother validating who was fronting and treating them thoroughly as different people was really good. Foster was okay with talking to them and stuff like that. I don't like the hypnosis thing, but that's not horrible necessarily. But it feels way too early with nowhere near enough like safeguards or coping skills or anything like that in place, and with knowing way too little about the system and what you might be getting into, the types of damage you could do with that. And then the straight up assault is uncalled for and unforgivable, so you could argue that he literally tortured them for information. So there's that. But anyway, those are my main thoughts on it, and I'm gonna finish wrapping this up because, like I said, I'm running out of time. Thank you for watching this Lie to Me episode of DID in the Media. We do these semi-regularly. We're aiming for roughly monthly currently. Maybe a little less than monthly until we get up to 2 videos a week like we're hoping to do. But again, if you want to see the extended version on Patreon, the link to that is in the description, as well as the links to a bunch of other stuff like our wishlist and our Discord and our Etsy shop and all of those things. And speaking of the wishlist and Patreon, when we get items from the wish list in the mail, we are starting to open them in little unboxing clips and putting those on Patreon publicly for anybody who wants to go see them, so you don't have to pay to see those. So if you want to see any of those, the link to that, like I said, is in the description. We will also put recommended videos and playlists and things on the screen, and the patrons that we currently have, to give them a special thank you. And please remember to like and subscribe if you like these videos, and to make sure you see the ones we make in the future. Those things help us out a lot, and those are free, so we will make another one of these soon. And all of you are awesome in any of the ways that you're able to support us and the things that we do. So thank you so much for watching. Bye.